Joining me now is CTV News political commentator and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair. Tom, this morning it's an interesting, I think juxtaposition, if you will, how the PM is proposing an austerity plan, yet also wants to boost spending in order to help the economy. What do you make of the comments on day one?
It is a very tough road to hoe, but, Carney has set himself up for that, and he's got to accomplish it now. He was elected basically on twin pillars. He said he was the person to take on Trump, and he was going to accomplish big things for the economy and clean up the mess left by Justin Trudeau. On the Trump front, Matt, I believe most Canadians are going to give him an even break in the sense that it's taking a little bit more time. The conversations are continuing. We're still in a good place compared to a lot of other countries in the world. And Canadians, I think, are giving a little bit of space to Carney on that one. Where Canadians will be unforgiving, because a lot of votes that were going to the Conservatives moved over to the Liberals when Carney said, I'm going to clean up government spending. That is an obligation of result. He can't just say, well, I tried. He actually has to produce the result. And that's what this meeting is about, by the way. His cabinet is being read the Riot Act because you can be sure that a bunch of them are coming in, having been convinced by their deputy ministers that there's just no way to cut 15% in their ministry. They have to do things a little bit differently because they're that important. I've been through this as a cabinet minister. We came into a real mess in the early 2000s in Quebec City that had been left by the previous government. And you can actually do that. You can make these cuts if you've got everybody on side and you're working very hard. And that's the key here. Carney has to keep everybody on side. I believe that the voting public that reversed the 27% lead for the Conservatives and put Carney in office, they're on his side for the cuts that are coming. He's not even shy, Matt, to use the word austerity, which is usually a taboo in politics. You don't want to be tagged with that word austerity. He's picking it up completely. He's holding it to close and saying, no, this is going to be an austerity budget. But at the same time, he says we have investments to make because Canada has become a place where we just couldn't get big things done. And he says that's exactly what he's about. So it's a big, tall order, and he's setting himself up to accomplish that, but he has to keep his cabinet on side. There are a couple of things where he has to be careful. The first is with Indigenous Canadians. If First Nations and Métis, Inuit Canadians are very worried about what these cuts could mean for them and for their communities, and he's got to get that one right. He's had a lot of meetings with them, and that's a very good sign. When we went through the Air Canada strike, I don't think that his government was careful enough about keeping the social partners, that are the workers and the unions, on side. Because it's one thing to say you want to cut the government, and you know that the federal civil service unions are going to be beating you up. That's inevitable, and that's a set piece. That's predictable. But the rest of the working world, Canadians who voted for Carney, they don't want to be made the bad guys in this. And they want to have a Carney that understands the importance of keeping working people on side. When François-Philippe Champagne talks about housing, talks about the cost of living, he's trying to talk to those workers. Well, you've got to carry through on that. So it's a very tall order, but I do think that they're in a position to carry it off because it's a new mandate, and they've got a very strong mandate from the Canadian voting public to say, look, Trudeau left such a mess, we've got to do things differently.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of it and a little bit there, Tom, too, and some of the priorities of keeping in mind. Any cuts in particular? We talked about the federal public service and how big and to some, including the Conservatives, are saying how out of control that is, the size of government and whatnot. Yeah. But do you see outside of that, or is that particularly maybe one of the things that this government's going to focus on when the cuts come in the fall?
There are entire programs that can be gotten rid of without really affecting the service to the public. But it's, as you say, the Conservatives are spot on when they say that. The number one failing of Trudeau as an administrator, as a manager, was the size of the civil service. Look, he was there for 9 years, and in 9 years, he increased the size of the federal bureaucracy by 40%. And it was less efficient, not more. It was so inefficient after all those additions of new people that they had to give $20 billion a year in contracts to outside firms to do the work that the civil servants weren't doing. And by the way, I'm not slagging the civil servants individually. They're very good people who've got wonderful experience and background and training. But they're put into a situation where everything is backwards. It's almost as if the computer had never been invented. You just keep adding more and more people on, and then you give these outside contracts to do the work of this inefficient government. So that's the number one thing that Carney can and must change. And he'll have the public on side for that. Because Trudeau said at the beginning, he says, I'm always going to run deficits because it's good for the public. Long before the pandemic, he had already run up $100 billion in new debt for future generations to pay. Well, you can't keep going like that. Then the pandemic hit, and we had hundreds of billions of dollars in new debt added on top of everything else. That's what arrives on Carney's doorstep. He gets to look at the numbers now and say, okay, this is an absolute mess, and I have these very strong people, these good ministers, and they've got to deliver now. And that's what this meeting is about, and that's what Canadians are expecting.
Before I let you go, I do want to talk about the optics of Kevin Roberts, the right-wing American policy analyst who was supposed to talk to ministers today. PMO's and the Prime Minister's office saying today that that's not going to happen. Does this hurt Carney in any way? There was chatter and talk about the fact of that he was actually, an author of Project 2025 coming up to talk to Canadian ministers. But does that hurt him at all or not really?
I don't think it was a wise decision to begin with. So there will be a little bit of that will stick to Carney because he can say, well, it was somebody else's idea, but he's the boss and he's not the type to shy away from his own responsibilities. But I do think it was a singularly ill-advised invitation. I think they were wise to cancel it, but it will stick to them because they're almost going after some of these figures from the MAGA world that I don't think in any way, shape, or form reflect the thinking of the average Canadian. So I think that they were right to change their minds, but they should have gotten it right in the first place.
CTV News political commentator, former NDP leader Tom Mulcair. Tom, thanks for this. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Matt.